Welcome to TESO Consulting Group's DEI podcast series, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadow of Resistance. I'm Dr. Tonya Breland.
And I am Erika Leek.
Welcome back. I am Dr. Tonya Breland.
And I'm Erika Leek.
And this is our podcast, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadows of Resistance. And in this podcast, as many of you will remember who are returning, we discuss issues that prevent us from being socially just as a society and also free. That's free for everyone, right? And so our goal is to disrupt the status quo of racial inequality and inequity in systems. And each episode challenges us, but we also want to challenge you to be the change that we want to see in this world. And we are beginning our DEI Back to School series. So this is part one. This is episode one of that
tag
series.
an educator.
Just, repost this and tag any educator or all educators that you know, because this episode and the next 4 episodes are for you. So today's episode, part 1, is about managing the cultural mismatch. Yes, it is. And I bet you're wondering, what do we mean by this cultural mismatch? Yeah. So we're talking about what it looks like in most schools across the country. Believe it or not, 80%, more than 80% of teachers in classrooms across this entire country are white teachers, the majority of whom are white women, while only 20% of the teaching force is teachers of color. And so the student body, however, has become a lot more diversified, particularly in the last few years. So more than half of our country's student population is over 50% students of color.
Right.
So really we're talking about the majority of students now nationally are students of color. And so you can see how this might be a mismatch in terms of culture. So we have a predominantly white teaching force, but now we have a predominantly student population of color.
Right.
So why is that important?
So it's important to really know that that is in existence because teachers may find that they're clashing with their students in areas or spaces where maybe in the past they didn't have those clashes because the students looked more like them. And so with students who are becoming more and more increasingly diverse, coming from different ethnic backgrounds, that means that teachers may not necessarily know or understand some of the cultural reference points that students bring into the classroom.
I think that's really important because culture dictates so much of the way that we think, sort of the frameworks that we think from, right? We talked before about collectivism versus individualism, right? And so imagine being a student that comes from a cultural background where it is all about the collective. It's all about the group. But you're, as a teacher, you're teaching this student, but you come from a background where it's about the individual, right? So that can be a real clash in terms of practice, thinking, problem solving. That could be a real clash. And so that's just one example. But when we think about that cultural mismatch, there really can be this kind of misalignment between sort of just ways of being. And that really very often comes down to culture.
Right. And I have to just pause for a second just to remind people that there is no culture is a monolith. We've said this before in other episodes, and we've got to say it again, especially with this conversation, because you might think as a teacher, well, I've worked with Black students before, or I've worked with Latino students before, and I've worked with Asian students, and you may in your mind think that all the Black kids are similar, all the Asian kids are similar, all the Latino kids are similar, et cetera, et cetera. And the truth is they may have some similarities, but they ultimately are not the same, and we cannot make assumptions about our students just because we may have worked with one group or another in the past. And, just kind of a funny situation. So, there's a game that is unique to Black culture. And it has like different phrases and comments. And so I remember playing that game with our family, during the holidays. And it's funny because, it was our family and kind of some of our extended family. And so the young people seem to know all of the like phrases that were common in Black culture. And there were some phrases that I had no clue about. There were phrases that my husband had even less of a clue about, and he's a horrible game player. And one day he'll watch this episode, and he will laugh because it's true. He's a poor loser. He's very competitive, and so my mother never said those things, and so he's like upset because he can't guess the phrases, and so we're laughing, and it's hilarious. But the truth is, even in our own family. We realize that, and we're all Black.
Yeah.
We realize that we don't all have the same cultural reference points.
That's right.
And like for him, he got very frustrated because he's a poor loser. But for the rest of us, we just laughed it off and like, oh, really? You say that? Like kids say that, or people say that? So that was even a lesson in and of itself. That when we think about culture, even among our own, we could all be sitting around the table and all be of the same racial background and yet have different cultural reference points that we bring to the conversation, to the table. And so I say that because I think educators need to understand and give yourself grace in understanding that you may not know about all of your students and what they bring into the classroom. But the idea here is there's an opportunity for us to learn and to create some connection with all of our students, and that usually starts with a relationship.
Yeah, I think that's what it comes down to, that relationship, and really getting to know your students.
Right.
So wanting to get to know them and getting to know them.
Right.
And understanding that, like you said, within the group, there is as much individuality amongst a cultural group as there is in the groups that you are in, right? So we sort of, and I think what that means is, we just see the humanity in people, and that human tapestry means that there's so many differences, right?
Absolutely.
And so as a teacher, I think part of sort of managing that cultural mismatch, like you said, put aside those assumptions, right? Put aside those assumptions. And I will say that there are a few different ways that you can tell whether or not as a teacher, you are addressing that, or, successfully, I think, managing that cultural mismatch. If you see if there's disproportionality in your outcomes, like let's say you have a diverse group of students. I worked in a really wonderfully diverse district, and, it was important to me to look at the outcomes that different groups. So how are my Black girls doing? How are my white girls doing? How are my white boys doing? How are my Asian girls doing? Like all of those groups doing in proportion to each other. That was really important to me. So just take a look at that. Think about how you did last year in terms of discipline and academic outcomes and even social outcomes. To what extent do you have them actually working together, right? It's really important that these diverse groups of kids get to work with each other. I think that's a part of our role as educators, making sure that they understand how to work together. But I think that's the first place to start with, like, what has been my track record in this area?
That's good.
Yeah, and I think in doing that, like, so how will you develop relationships with your kids? What kinds of things will you do to get to know your kids? It was really important to me to know those things. So for instance, if I had a kid, it never failed. Every year I had a kid that loved, superheroes and Marvel or DC, or, they just, and I really used that in the relationship to grow the relationship with the kid. And so whatever that area was, I kind of used that knowledge about them and develop deeper relationships with them. And it really helped me in my instruction. I think that might be a really good place to start, to think about where are you going to begin to develop those relationships.
And those relationships are lifelong relationships. They really have an impact on students years later. I was just sharing with you how one of my former fourth grade students reached out to me. And this student is probably 27, 28 years old now. So I would have had her when she was 9. So she reaches out to me on social media and we connect or whatever. And she's a white student. And she's not a student now, but she was a student, back then. And she was sharing. She's like, I still talk about you. And so I'm like, oh, that's so great. You had such a great experience in fourth grade and what have you. And she's like, no, it's not about fourth grade. It's because you're my favorite teacher. And I'm like, wow, that is really
That's amazing.
I was just, my heart was so full. And this was just yesterday that I got that message. And, and I thought about that, and I thought about what we talk about all the time. It's about relationships. So ethnically, racially, she and I are not the same, yet the relationship that I had with her, and I remember her, she was a good kid, and I don't remember every single student I had, but some of them stood out, and she was one that stood out. I loved her personality. And, the fact that she today still talks about the impact that I had on her because of the relationship that I developed with her and probably several of her classmates. It really had a long-term impact on her all these years later. We're talking almost 20 years later, that she can still remember and talk about one of her favorite teachers, if not her favorite teacher, and it's a Black woman. That was powerful
that's
to me.
Amazing. That's awesome.
Yeah, and so I think
that's
same
so wonderful. And congrats on that,
Thank
right?
you.
So it's always so wonderful when years later, you hear from a kid and, they are able to just talk about how important you were to them.
Right.
That means something.
It does.
So
It
congrats
does.
on that.
Thank you.
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
But that relationship,
Yes.
it goes back. You've heard us say it so many times. It's so critical for teachers to develop authentic, positive relationships with their students. Because it makes a difference. It matters to them in what they do. When our son, who is now a performer, when he was in second grade, his white male teacher came to see him perform in the community. It was after school hours. He was not on the clock. He was not obligated in any way. But my son said, hey, I'm singing for the township. It was the town's imitation of American Idol.
Okay.
And he's like, I'm singing in the township's, idol show or whatever, and invited him. I didn't think anything of it, but he shows up. And I wonder how validating was that for my son at second grade, 7 years old. At 7 years old, that his teacher says, it's important to me to be here for something that's important to you. And he's there. And I wonder how much of that impacted my son saying, I definitely want to do this, because it validated part of who he is as, and who he has grown up to be as a young man.
Yeah, and I think it just says to kids, I see you, and I really value what you bring. I really value your talents and your gifts and your interests, and I'll support you in that. And I think that means something. But I also think, so once we've, you develop those relationships, I also think it's important, because I think that's a really good example of kind of going to the community where kids are, right? And so that's really important. So it's really important for that teacher to kind of go into Daniel's environment, right? That's really important, and that means something. And in spaces where you have 100 kids, it's probably not always possible, but I know that as a teacher, it was important when I showed up to games for kids, right? I just stayed after school. I was a high school teacher, so I was able to see kids play or cheer or whatever it is that they were doing. That was important. It was important to come back and go to those concerts, to just watch them in that. But it was more important to them, I think, when I actually went into the spaces where they lived and I went to their churches or, those kinds of civic groups that they were a part of and engaged in whatever it is that they were performing or just participating in. But I think even in spaces where, maybe it doesn't involve kids, I think when you realize that you have a cultural group that you may not be all that familiar with, I think seek out opportunities to be a part of, whatever the expression or a celebration is. So go to a festival, go to a Caribbean festival if you know that you have large numbers of kids that are, from one of the Caribbean cultures. Go to African American, festivals or those kinds of things, or so that you can really sort of immerse yourself in the culture.
I agree.
I think that's a really good way. And there's a concept called cultural humility. And what that means is that you understand that there is another culture different from yours that has as much to offer as your culture, and you're willing to learn about it. And through learning about it, you immerse yourself in it. And so those kinds of opportunities are really important because it does give you some insight into the way that students that come from, as we said earlier, no culture is a monolith, no race is a monolith, but it does give you some insight into some of the patterns that you might be seeing or some of the experiences that you might be having that you may not quite understand.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, when I think about this whole piece of managing the cultural mismatch, we can't avoid something that's probably most uncomfortable for educators, and that's the topic of being willing to confront your biases. That's very much a part of a culturally responsive educator, is saying, okay, I need to understand what my biases are towards groups of people. And some of that comes from learning about your own culture and the reference points. So maybe you can kind of explain when we talk about reference points, understanding your own cultural reference points and your students' cultural reference points, and what it is that makes you different from them, and or them different from you.
Yeah. So culture dictates the way that we operate, the way that we think about things, the way that we express certain concepts. So take, for instance, a concept like respect.
Sure.
Right? So respect looks different in different cultures. Okay? So one of the things I talk about in my training is that when I was growing up, when you were talking to, I'll just use my parents as an example. So when I was talking to them, I couldn't have my arms folded. That was a sign of disrespect. So, and there were times when I would talk to my mom, I couldn't even really get out whatever it is I was talking to without whatever it is I was going to say without her saying, uncross your arms, right? Because you could not, that was a sign of disrespect. My brothers couldn't have their hands in their pockets when they were talking to my mom or dad, because there were these really outward shows of respect, right? And so when I became a teacher, what I realized is that there were behaviors that I took as disrespectful that my students did not necessarily grow up with, or they didn't have those same kind of indicators of respect. So if I was talking to a student and they had their arms crossed, it didn't mean that they lacked respect for me, right? So
it didn't necessarily
mean that, right?
You can't assume that.
Can't assume that. So what I had to do really was really think about the way that I interacted with my students and how so what I understood very early on. So one of the rules, classroom rules that a lot of teachers have at the top of their list is respect everybody and yourself and everything like that. And that is that concept is good. But I think when we talk about that cultural mismatch, understand that culture determines what respect looks like.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I think
some cultures eye contact or not giving
Yeah.
eye contact is considered respectful.
That's right.
But it's not uncommon that if a student doesn't look at a teacher in the eye, that the teacher thinks negatively of them, because in that teacher's culture, eye contact is really important and is a sign of respect. But in that child's culture, eye contact is considered disrespectful.
I even remember, like growing up, if you got into trouble or whatever, it was disrespectful to talk back. So if you felt like, well, this is why I did. If you were to like defend yourself, that was disrespectful. Don't talk back, right?
That's correct.
And so at the same time, though, and I can remember this, like one of my brothers, he was just really, really quiet, but we were also sort of taught not to talk back to figures of authority. But then when a teacher wanted a response in terms of like an area of misbehavior and we didn't give it to them, in school that was seen as disrespectful because we didn't respond or we didn't, sort of engage with the teacher. And that was a really clear sign of a cultural mismatch, because at home it was, don't talk back. So you're going to get your lecture or whatever it is that you're going to get, and then you have there was nothing that you could say back because you would get into more trouble. At school, though, you were expected to kind of answer for your actions. And so we had to really kind of navigate, right, that, and it was up to the student, which I think is unfair, right? Because I think we need to say to students, there are these different cultural contexts that you will be expected to navigate and to operate in. And we're going to teach you to be bicultural. We understand that this is an expectation in this context, but we also want you to understand that this is an expectation in this context. And so I think sort of really teaching them that bicultural, that concept of being bicultural, I think is really important.
So important.
So important.
So important. No, these are really good examples that you were providing that can really speak to like where there may be a clash for students.
Yeah.
And communication is another big one.
Yes.
Another big area where the way that you speak, it's not uncommon for teachers to make assumptions about certain groups of students being loud.
Yes.
And it could be that it's not that those students are being loud. It could be that is just a part of their culture, that they come across, with a certain level of volume, that you speak up when you're spoken to and what have you. And unless that teacher takes the time to really understand what's different in each student's culture, then that student and that teacher will clash, from time to time.
Yes.
And it may not even be that the student is doing something negative or doing something bad. It's just there's an assumption that's being made about that student that's an unfair assumption. Because that teacher doesn't recognize that here is where my culture says one thing, but that student's culture may say something entirely different about how to respond and how to communicate in certain situations.
I think that's so good. I think that's so good about the messages, like whether we kind of realize them or not, or whether we think about them or not. And I think that goes back to not making assumptions.
Right.
Like in really sort of opening up what these messages are.
Right.
As teachers, there's a fair amount of behavior that we really try to impose. And I think really thinking about like what that means, and what messages, the behaviors that you choose to impose, those hills that we die on as teachers, right? Like
So
this
not necessary.
is not necessary.
Right.
It's not necessary.
Right.
And
and I have to say, and just interject for a second, we hear in the field teachers complaining about students' behaviors being worse or different, even post-pandemic. And I think that there's an opportunity for teachers at this point to really be able to say, let me develop the kind of relationships that I can understand some of the behaviors that we're seeing that I might be misjudging, or miscalculating what's going on with students. But those relationships are what gives me an opportunity to kind of dig deeper into what might be going on and what might be behind certain behaviors. And the behaviors may or may not be cultural, but many times they are.
Yeah.
Or based in cultural reference points, or just what one group brings into an environment versus another group, and that's really, I think that's really important. But that's also part of that, being willing to confront your biases. So students aren't afraid to tell a teacher or to identify. They are very discerning, so they know when the teacher has connected with them.
Yes, they do.
And they will demonstrate in many ways when they are not connected to their teacher.
Yes.
And so that's where we might begin to see acting out behavior, because students who are connected to their teachers do have less negative behaviors in the classroom, period.
Yeah. I think that's really important. And I think if you think of yourself as an educator, as a student, as studying your students, then one of the things you can do is really just sort of track the behaviors, right?
And the interactions.
Track the interactions, because if you feel like there's sort of like overwhelmingly negative, behaviors, or if you're worried about it, or if you have concerns about it, just track them and try to track them objectively. So we had this interaction. What happened? What did you say? What did the student say? And really try to do that over a few weeks. This is one of the suggestions. I think it's in Zaretta Hammond's Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. And I think that kind of gives you gives you some data.
Yes.
Really,
right.
around the nature of interactions that you have with students, with groups of students, particularly if you've noticed a pattern of negativity when it comes to certain groups. I think that might really kind of give you a really nice starting point, and start at the beginning of the year. And I know that there's a lot happening in the beginning of the year, but the truth is,
you're setting the tone.
Yes, you set the tone, because the way that you begin the year is often the way that you end it. And there's a connection between the start and the finish of the year.
That's
and
correct.
Very often we end the years as educators like overwhelmed, and we're frustrated. And the school years are long, and there's a lot that happens. And I get that as an educator. But when we think about the way that we begin this process of the school year, there are seeds in the beginning. So what are the intentional seeds that you can plant as an educator so that you have the outcomes, those desirable outcomes amongst all your groups?
And I think another intentional seed that needs to be planted in the classroom really is centered around open dialogue about race and ethnicity. So I know we live in a polarized country right now, society. But as an educator, you owe it to your students, to your diverse groups of students, to really have open conversation about race and culture and ethnicity, and understanding one another, and creating this environment where students feel like, it's okay to have a perspective about something.
Yes.
It's okay to not know something. The younger your students are and the older they are, there are opportunities for you to create intentional moments of dialogue.
Yes.
It could be centered around a text, that you're reading, and what students notice about a text and the characters in that text, and that then can span some conversations. It could be centered around articles, that might be creating where you can create conversations about racial groups or ethnic groups.
I think that's really good. I think a text is a great place to start. Some of you may have actually started these conversations, previously. So we'd love for you to respond with different things that worked really well for you. And we invite you to continue listening to this series, because our next episode will really dig deeper into one of the social justice standards from learningforjustice.org, right?
Yes.
And they have a really great repository of resources for teachers if you're not quite comfortable with having those open dialogues that are really necessary for our kids.
Right.
And so, so if you would just, comment, let us know how you engage in these conversations with your students, how you plan to, what kinds of resources you plan to use, and also we invite you to continue listening.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We love when you come and listen to us and when you share with folks. So feel free to share this podcast episode as well as any of our other episodes with people that you know, and let us know your thoughts. Thank you again for joining us. Again, I'm Tonya.
And I'm Erika, and thank you so much for joining us today.